I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Welcome, everyone,
Welcome to
Arcane Mark with GM Tools. So you improvised. What's next? There's a lot of shows that have been put on and essays and blogs that have been written about how to improvise in a tabletop RPG. Best practices, ways you can loosen up and use more improv as compared to like having everything prepared in advance. But not a lot has been spoken, or at least not as nearly as much about like the aftermath of your improv. Because improv is great when it's happening in the moment. I have a very improvisational style myself. But if you don't know what to do next and what to do sort of like during and just barely after and what to do like significantly after you improv, it can sometimes lessen the effect of your improv or cause you issues later on down the line. And that's what this episode is about. Somewhat less talked about what's next.
One way that I like to think about it is when you're constructing something and that you've prepped in advance, you could build it from the ground up. You can have roots, and then the roots go up into a beautiful tree that have all this foundation, and it branches out and it has all these connections everywhere. But then when you come up with something on the fly and you improvised it, you are not going to have come up with how does that connect to literally everything else in my plot at the same time, and where did it come from and where is it headed?
That's right. It's the sort of the principle that is known as, for the great philosopher Cotton Eye Joe. Where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from? Cotton Eye Joe. And so similarly, when it comes to your improvisation, you're going to want to make a note of whatever you improvised. If you came up with names for characters, new countries, a deity, whatever you just came up with when you're improvising, make some quick notes so that you can remember that you did improvise that. And then, like Linda said, after the session or during a break or at some point in time, you're going to want to look if you have a web of interconnections and try to start drawing some lines to connect these pieces together and make sure that what you improvise is a part of the whole. And if it looks like it's jarring and it's like a jigsaw puzzle with one of the pieces that doesn't fit in, what are other things you can change to fit in with what you just improvised?
Because you might have had a plan but if your plan has elements that you haven't shown to the players yet, it's a lot easier to squidge things around. If you're like, well, this doesn't quite work together with my motivation for this villain, because my motivation for this villain means that has to do with the conditions in this particular part of the town, but that's not consistent with what I picked for this character's backstory, then, maybe you need to switch things around a little bit to make a system that's consistent within itself.
That's right. And so there are more things that you may have to change. You have to be sure that you're not like considering everything that were in your original plans to be sacred. It's important to note that whatever you presented to the players during the session is what they know. They don't know any of the things that were in your secret plans. You can change those. In fact, if you have to, you can change the things you presented during the session. If you come back and like, look guys, I improvised last time, and when I said as an improvisation that there are no temples in the city that can provide healing magic, I looked, and this is actually like the place where the head temple of the goddess of healing is. So that's not exactly true, and we're just gonna say that they were closed on that day for a grand holiday of healing mass where everybody does some mental health wellness by not coming to work. And that's why you couldn't find them that day, but there is a healing temple in the city. Like, you can come up with something, or even ask, be like, what do you guys think? You tell me. This is the Grand Temple of Healing, and yet you weren't able to find it. Give me some reasons. Why were you not able to get healing there? Maybe they'll come up with a good idea for you. Your players can be your collaborators if you just are honest with them and let them know. It's like, I messed up.
We need some reason why this.
It's like, we can retcon if we have to, but I think it'd be funny if we come up with better if we come up with a reason. I'm willing to listen.
And then you can be like, The wizard's always claiming that, like, he's the best at directions, but he's not very good at directions. So the wizard decided to take charge and actually everybody, and wound up bringing everyone in circles. And then the next day, other people decided to talk about it. It's like, wait a minute, I don't think that quite feels right.
The wizard player could be just like, I never liked the goddess of healing anyway. She's always going on about healing and healing. So when I think about healing, I just ignored her. When I told you guys there were no temples of the goddess of healing deities in the city, I meant real deities, not the goddess of healing.
People are like, what the heck, wizard?
But if the wizard's player decides that that's what they want to do, then that's what they want to do. Math Guy Day said the guard Bob just didn't know that temple existed because they asked Bob the guard to show them to that temple.
Or somebody asked, oh yeah, that could be funny too, because maybe the guard Bob
It's a reference to Bob the guard sending me to the wrong place in Shackled City.
But to pull at it and more and take it more seriously, maybe they talk to someone who's like, yeah, sure, there's definitely no temples of healing in the city, and they're being sarcastic. Because it's the headquarters of the healing goddess and they didn't figure it out.
Kojo gives a good point. Says it feels like if you're, quote, good at improv, you could just keep on improving. If you're not, you need a plan to improv. I would say this. Masters at improv may have picked up over the years by failing until we succeed certain skills that are for before, during, and after improv. But if you are just starting at improving or you're just dipping your toes in there, you're going to have seen a lot of advice of what to do during and like how to be like yes and. But some of the things you learn most by actually improving are that some of those subtle shifts that you do after improvising are ones that will help you improvise better the next time.
One thing that this is an improv tip, but it is one that will help you a lot with the what's next, is to be very careful about only best, worst, largest, smallest, and other words that are going to lock you out of other options. Never, exactly. Because then if you definitively say, you know, this is the most powerful sorcerer in all the land, and then you realize, oh wait, I just locked myself out of something.
Even if there's secretly a more powerful sorcerer, there couldn't openly be a more powerful sorcerer in all the land if you said this is definitely the one who's considered the most powerful.
Yeah. Or even like the leader of, you know, if you can make the stuff that you're adding be like less, hey, this is the big giant one and I can't then step around it easily, the more you're going to help yourself later on.
Dunning-Kruger sorcerer.
Yes.
Maybe the sorcerer's name is Dunning-Kruger. It's like, it is I, Dunning of House Kruger, the sorcerer. I am the greatest of all sorcerers.
He thinks he's the best sorcerer. He's just the best liar.
He's just good at pretending.
Yep.
So, when it comes to improvising, you can always think of a way to make things work. And you could do that by improvising on your improvising, on your improvising, on your improvising. But, that starts taking more and more intricate and well-defined improv skills to be able to keep doing it that you may not have built up yet as an improviser. And B, even if you can do that, it's still going to have some issues because if you don't take any notes about what you improvised or try at all to connect them to anything else, you're
relying
gonna forget.
Entirely on your memory and like you don't play for a month and good luck.
Nobody has that much memory. You're either relying on your memory or you're anti-relying on your player's memory. You're relying on them to have a poor memory so that they don't remember anything from last time. So it
doesn't matter, yeah.
So it doesn't matter because if you make up something different this time that contradicts it, they'll be like, okay, because they didn't remember it at all. So
speaking of relying on the player's memory, a strategy that I have sometimes used is when I feel like, when I'm thinking like, oh crap, that didn't quite gel with the improv that I did, is asking the table collectively what they remember about a certain situation. And then I can make sure to use the pieces that they remember, and then if there are little bits that didn't quite work out that they didn't remember anyway, then I don't have to worry about it.
That's right. Rico has another tip for people who need to improvise, is that if you're improvising, Rico says, for example, your players try to make a soup out of a Glabrazu claw during the session, you can post live on the Arcane Mark Discord during the session after they crit fail their recall knowledge and make the Glabrazu claw soup, and then just do whatever Mark says.
Glabrazu claw soup, huh?
Yes.
So crit fail on them thinking that eating Glabrezu claw soup was a good idea.
Yeah, they crit failed on it, and they decided to make a Glabrezu claw soup. And so then Rico posted it on the Discord, and I said that, like, he could just wait until they say, I wish something at some point after that, and then have a really twisted Glabrezu style wish happen. Because they ate it, and now they've inherited some of its twisted wish powers that it has to grant, like, monkey's paw, like, wishes.
Oh, yeah,
and
awesome.
then Rico said that, like, a month later, like, they finally said something that was in the effect of I wish, and it all happened.
Excellent.
Yep. So, yeah, they learned that the claws made good soup from the critical failure on Recall Knowledge, which was the improv of Recall Knowledge, but then they decided to make the soup. It was 4 months later in real life when they ran into a genie. And the Glabrezu claw soup came back to bite them. So, yes.
See the question, why on earth would you eat a demon? Or that or any aberration?
It was a failed
critical failure.
It's like crab. It's a delicacy. Oh, yeah, he has to track who ate the soup. So I think that
that's a great example of you had a situation that came up and you needed to, like, take notes and keep track of it.
Yes, so even though you took the arguably not scalable up to the next, like, category of number of people technique of asking Mark on the Arcade Mark Discord what to do for your improv, you still needed to take notes and you needed to track over a few months before you could have that Chekhov's gun fire. You couldn't just, like, kind of do it and then mostly forget about it. It was something you had to actively move on after the improvisation. That's a great example of what we're talking about here. Just because you improvise during the session doesn't mean that you could just, like, completely wing everything.
Yeah. And that also points to one thing that you can do, another thing that you can do during improvisation that then really interacts with the after improvisation time is sort of the ominous implication. Where there are, from a, like, organized play standpoint, the boon that you could get on your chronicle sheet that's like, this will have an effect in a future adventure. The idea that, like, there's a placeholder, something is going to happen later, and you'll go in and fill it in.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get the time later on to go in and fill it in and plan out when that's going to happen.
It's the equivalent of an RPG where you, like, pull the lever and it's like you hear the sound of something moving elsewhere.
Yes.
Comes up on the screen.
And then that'll give you more time to figure out what you want to do.
Maybe you don't know yet what it is.
Yeah, you don't have to know what it is. As long as you generally, like, you want to have it planned to have, like, a specific trigger and to happen, relatively soon. So people are still going to remember what happened.
Like, the Glabrezu claw is a good example of a specific trigger. But here's the thing. You don't necessarily need to know what the trigger is. You could have a list that you keep with your notes that's called, like, you call it Chekhov's Guns.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a list of all the things that you improved around that seemed ominous at the time and that either you noted or the players are like, well, that's going to come back later on. That you haven't even figured out what they're for.
Yes.
And then that way, later on, it's another great example of how taking notes after the fact can help you later on, because when you're improvising again sometime later, and you're like, oh no, and now we're dealing with this, thinking, wait a minute, that's similar to that Chekhov's gun that I have on this list sitting in front of me. I could say that Chekhov's gun was linked to this
If
thing.
you're like, oh my gosh, how do we get the PCs out of this situation? Well, I have a note that these people owed a favor and promised they'd come back to repay it someday. I can use them to get the PCs out of the situation, and it won't feel like a butt pull. It'll feel like it was fair and earned.
That's right. Like, I had a situation in a setting where, like, narrative tropes always wind up happening, where I just had a list of Chekhov's guns in the favor of the players that were going to fire at some point, and a list of, like, the 20 different enemy organizations that were all trying to attack at each other and the PCs at the same time, and the different groups of PCs who had entered into try to do something independently of each other. And I randomly rolled who ran into each other, and I kept the Chekhov's guns as ways to help the PCs at appropriate times. And so the PCs, some of the PCs who were genre savvy knew that there were Chekhov's guns. Of like, well, these people said that they were gonna send us reinforcements, and they haven't come yet. So They were like, until all of these guns fire, we at least know we're not in a dire situation.
Yes.
Once they've all fired and then something bad happens, we're in big trouble. Because the next narrative cost, other than just using the Chekhov's gun up and being like, they came in and saved us, could be like somebody's noble sacrifice to die or some like really bad, nasty thing.
That was really funny though, because the character achieved a major goal in a way that felt kind of easy, and then I was telling Mark after the fact, I was like, that felt like it was pretty easy. I'm not sure if that necessarily felt earned. And then, like, he comes back, like, the next sessions, and it's like, and then these 20 enemy groups all attack. It was, like, the best thing.
When you took down the barrier, Linda.
I know.
Your goal was to take down the barrier that was up there for a reason.
It was up there for a reason. And then, like, 20 enemy groups attacked at the same time, and they were attacking each other, and it was just utter nonsense.
There weren't any giant enemy crabs,
There weren't any giant enemy crabs. No, there's much worse than the giant enemy crabs. There was
a lot of things that were there.
All sorts of nonsense.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's a good example of how you could even improvise during a session while having a list of things to improvise from.
Now, here's an example of improv. A situation where after a number of horrible crit fails, an NPC enemy simply gave up and walked away dejectedly. Improvising the fact that he went back home and changed loyalties as he decided he was fighting fate itself. This caused a schism among their group, which the PCs will eventually discover. Oh, that's amazing.
That is pretty funny. It's a whole subplot based on rolling lots of natural ones and being like, fate is against me. Yeah, I've definitely had situations where as a player I improvise on things like that where like a character who's arrogant about their magic and the enemy just like critically succeeds multiple times in a row to save against it is like, this creature's immune to this type of magic. Obviously, my spells wouldn't have failed that badly that many times in a row, or I mean they could have, but statistically they're probably immune. I'm just gonna stop using this. And Linda was like, they were not immune. I was like, I know, like, you told me what you were rolling, but, like, if you think, the probability of you rolling 19 and 20 5 times in a row
yes,
is much less than the probability that you rolled, like, a normal distribution and they were just immune.
That's correct.
And Matt Guy Dave talks about player improvisation as well, sometimes taking more tracking and triggers than GM improvisation. It can. It absolutely can. Just because we call this a GM tools episode doesn't mean players can't use these tools to help in their own improvisation. The key is that you generally, like, the real secret to improv is that it's a set of tools that will help you make decisions that are not based entirely on prep work.
Mm-hmm.
But the secret of prep work is you can do prep work at any point in time. You can do it in the past. In that case, it's not improving because you prepared for it. You can do prep work afterwards. That's what we're talking about in this episode, where you improv and then you do setup work to make sure that the improv stuff will work. Or you can sort of do prep work as you're going. And
especially if you're like, let's take a 5-minute break or whatever, and so you can think about things.
That's things where you make notes as you're improving or just before you're improving, and you sometimes have to work quickly when you're doing it as you're going, because otherwise you can mess with the momentum of your group.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, a lot of times when you have improv, it's going to be because something happened that you as the GM didn't expect to happen. So 2 common causes of that are, as just was mentioned here, unexpected dice rolls, and another one being players doing things that you absolutely didn't expect them to do.
Absolutely.
So, like, for example, players going to a location you didn't expect or taking a completely different strategy from what you expected. And sometimes, when the characters do something and you're looking at it like a GM being like, they did what now? The NPCs who were involved in the situation may be just as shocked, because they might have, if their model of what will the PCs do is based on what you've seen the PCs do, and then they just pull something completely out of left field that's a different strategy, they might be like, what? This group that always charges in straight forward is now deciding to do a nighttime ambush?
This is so unlike them. What's going on? Is this even the same group? And so it can make sense for the NPCs to be caught flat-footed when, in the same way that you are, when the PCs just totally change up what their MO is.
And then you can use the time where the NPCs are kind of scrambling and not, like, reacting great to things, to give yourself time to think about, okay, what are they going to do when they get their footing out under them, rather than having them react right away in a totally, yes, we have been waiting for you fashion.
That's right. So the main key thing is when you improvise, do what you need to do in the moment to make sure you're ready for next steps. And then once you're out of the pressing time when you're improvising and you're doing things like very actively that use up your attention, when you've got to pause, either it's pausing the game or after the game is over, that's when you go and you reconcile to make sure that what you've done works and that it's not going to cause you any issues moving forward, and that you know what you did.
Yeah, and in the same way that, an encounter might be surprised, there may be an NPC who's wasn't prepared for a certain conversation, and then after the fact they come back and they're like, that wasn't quite accurate. Just like in real life, people have conversations and then they have time to think things through, and they may come to a different perspective later on.
That's true.
Or they might forget something that they didn't mention.
It's more realistic for someone to forget something really important every once in a while than for everybody to always mention all of the most important details because it was a pre-planned adventure where 3 editors looked at it and found all the important details to make sure they couldn't leave it off. In real life, trust me, trust anyone who has had a job with a boss in it.
Yes.
Is that you're going to be missing key details that you only find out about later, and you're going to have gotten started on it before they'd be like, oh, yes, I'm sending you a sending just to remind you that I forgot, but you should bring protection from fire. And then the burned adventure's like, really?
Really? I don't know.
Thanks. When did you find that out? Oh, I knew that the whole time. I just forgot to tell you.
Well, we're already in the volcano that you didn't tell us about, so...
Yes, I said mountain, didn't I? But I meant it was a volcano. I mean, that's a type of mountain. I thought you knew it was a volcano. So, Kojo wonders how frequently does improv come up in pre-written adventures. So, I would say this. There are only a few pre-written adventures that flat out tell you, I don't know what we're going to do here, just improv, because of the fact that people get mad at that being in the adventure, and so therefore it gets memorable because it'll get like negative reviews, even though sometimes it's appropriate to let the GMs flex things occasionally, but when people buy pre-published adventures, they want it all. Like Council of Thieves Books 1 had a sewer section that was like, I don't know, improv this part. You can generate the rest of the XP. Even after the sewers, there was a section to be like, do some other adventures, here's some ideas.
So it's not as likely to come up in terms of the adventure directly planning for it.
Yes.
But when the PCs do something that causes things to go off script, or when the dice do something that causes things to go off script, like, they got defeated by an encounter, or they antagonized the person the adventure expected them to ally with under basically any circumstances, or that sort of thing, then usually with pre-written adventures, it's more about like a plan for trying to arc back to the published story to whatever extent you decide that's a priority.
Correct. That's why I started by saying very few pre-written adventures just tell you, I don't know, improvise. But exactly as Linda said and Caroline said in chat, you absolutely will need to improvise in pre-written adventures a fair amount. And in fact, while you won't need to, if the PCs stay on track, you won't need to improvise whole plot beats and dungeons. Mm-hmm. But you may very well have to do small-scale improvisational guiding to make sure things do stay on track for the adventure path that you might not have needed to do in the moment for your own home campaign, where you hadn't really decided exactly where it was going and you wanted to let the players decide. Maybe during the moments in the session, you wouldn't have needed to improvise. You just kind of let them do what they're doing. Then afterwards, you could have spent a lot of prep work writing a new dungeon or whatever you were going to do. Mm-hmm. Whereas with the pre-published adventure, maybe it's like, well, no, we got to go to this dungeon. It's the pre-published adventure. And that may force you to do more improvisation.
Yeah, because you're like, well, you know what? I have the maps for this and I have everything all ready for it. I want to make sure that they get to the dungeon here. So then you would need to make some kind of a plan for getting them to get there, or for finding some other way to And I said it's like the extent to which you decide you want to prioritize it, right? Because you might also decide, well, I want to keep these major set pieces, but I don't care what happens about these smaller bits and bobs. Like if they don't go to the dungeon in area Q, like whatever, the mini dungeon, but I do want to make sure that like by the end that this happens. This major event is something that they experience.
Right. And so improv tools are helpful no matter whether you're using a published adventure or not. And in fact, the after improv work is nowhere is it more important than with a published adventure, because there's a whole corpus of stuff that your improv might conflict with if you are running a published adventure, whereas when you're not, even though I say you definitely should keep track of how you improv, and like Linda said, connect where you come from and where did you go in the Cotton Eye Joe principle, when it comes to a pre-published adventure, it's even more important.
This is especially true if you haven't read the entire pre-published adventure before you start.
For instance, if you're running on a Paizo Adventure Path subscription and you're like, oh my gosh, Paizo has just published the best adventure path ever made. It's perfect for my group. It just came out. I've got the first volume. Let's go. Then you couldn't have even read the other one.
Yeah.
There's a little summary at the beginning of that will tell, like in the first book, that will tell you at the end of the first book.
Yeah.
That will tell you how things are going to work out, but you won't have the details for it. There's going to be a lot of small connective pieces.
So you're not going to necessarily realize that this NPC who your players thought was interesting is secretly good. It's supposed to be a traitor in book 5 or whatever. And then you're like, oh, crud. Who can fulfill that role? So, like, part of that, I would say, is, read what you can. And then in that way, in doing your prep in between sessions, you'll find the point where it's like, oh, this person actually reveals themselves to have been in role X. And then you can be like, okay, well, what other character can fulfill that role? Or was that character initially in that particular role, and then they found themselves being charmed by the PCs, maybe not literal charm spell, but thinking the PCs were cool and then deciding to do something a little bit different? Or like, how can I square things away so that these kinds of major plot beats still happen? Or maybe some of the plot beats will happen differently because that character doesn't do that particular role and somebody else handles the pieces that are still necessary to keep the major arc going.
And Rico mentions his players, I wonder how many others adopted these orphans, and Rico quietly pretending he didn't just improvise that orphans make the side quest make more sense and not end unsatisfyingly. Yeah, exactly. When you improvise well enough, people might not know that you did anything at all. And Kojo had a friend who's more experienced with Pathfinder say it's often better to get an AP after it's finished. And I agree. I always read the whole adventure path first. You make connections. There's sometimes connectivity bits that need a little work, just because of the fact that even as they were being published and developed, the other adventures weren't there together. And I always like to work on those joints a little bit myself. So one thing that Steven really felt with Multi-Part Adventures and wanted in Jewel of the Indigo Isles to have good connective tissue. It was all published at the same time, so it was a little easier there. Kojo also said this is 2 more data points, telling him to take an improv class at some point. I would say just because improv is a powerful tool for your role-playing game, that doesn't necessarily mean that an improv acting class is necessary to improv in your tabletop RPG. It could be helpful. There's certain techniques in improv classes that will help you as a GM, but there's certain things that are true in improv acting that are not necessarily true for improving when you're a GM that's improving for your game. So really the main thing that will improve your GM improv is doing some GM improv and seeing where it works and seeing where it falls flat. That's part of this episode, is my using my own knowledge of times where improv has caused issues to give advice so that you might know in advance how best to avoid those potential issues from improv.
Mm-hmm. Thinking again about through some of the examples of weird stuff that's popped up from improv in my games, sometimes in the Chekhov's gun type thing that you mentioned, finding way, because it does go both directions with those Chekhov's guns. There's both like, you know, how can I pull on those to solve issues later on, and there's also like, how do I make sure that these come back up again later? Like if the player gets some major powerful whatever, then making sure that it's relevant. Like I had a player in Kingmaker, thanks to the effects of the one of the hero deck of many things, get like a turbo wish type ability. And so it's like, okay, well, I know my players, they're going to hoard that to the very end of the campaign because they're never going to know, like, when they would need it. So coming up with something cool that they could do with that at the end that wasn't just like, that will allow them to get, like, a better ending than the AP would naturally expect.
To be fair, we postulated intentionally using the wish in basically that way, like, not long after receiving it. We asked the player if he was okay with that, and then we were like, this is what we want to use it for if we don't have to use it for something else defensively up until that point. So that was one that was sort of collaborative, and that was surprisingly not hoardy for us, is that we had a proactive plan to use that Turbo Wish to redeem the BBEG. And so you were able to know in advance that, and you were able to create like an alternate encounter based on that.
Oh yeah, that's right. We have been discussing that. I remembered all the planning that and the prep that went into making that happen.
Yes, we said that if we didn't have anything else we had to use it for, that was our overall goal, and we achieved it. And Owlcat seemed to think that doing something similar without a Turbo Wish could be interesting as well in Kingmaker.
Mm-hmm.
So, essentially, the main thesis of this episode turned out to be the Cotton Eye Joe principle all along, which I didn't know we were going to.
I mean, we improv this episode.
We
right?
improv
we didn't
the name of that.
Yeah.
That's true.
We didn't prep to say Cotton Eye Joe.
That was just something that I realized when Linda was saying, like, where did you come from and where do you go? So, yeah, I think that covers what I wanted to say in this episode. It's a fairly simple set of tips, tricks, and advice, but it's one that is often overlooked and is very important to remember when you're going through improv in your tabletop RPG. Do you have any other post-improv advice?
I want to touch on this comment we just got. Ceding a lot of narrative control to the players, much more than many other GMs, so they can use a hero point to edit a scene. And one thing it definitely requires is the ability to improv when players add something to the scene that you weren't expecting.
Yeah, that's definitely true. You have to decide in your tabletop RPG what you're going to do when it comes to narrative control and adding scenes. There's plot twist cards that Paizo put out in PF1. And you want to make sure you have the right group and players who are going to, like, work well with those plot twist cards, because it can especially be tricky when you're running a published adventure. I know that I was playing in a Paizo staff game that was a published adventure path and it had plot twist cards, and I often had trouble using the plot twist cards because I would see something that was just like the plot twist card they would give specific plot twists you're allowed to do if they come up. So there was one that I got that was just like the villain messed up and left a clue exposing their identity and location. And so we were in a place, and we were doing like Giant Slayer. We just started at the beginning, and it was like, oh no, someone like tore up this room at the inn. We don't know who it was. It's like, well, that's not good. That's actually, they like destroyed the room. They stole stuff. They may have killed someone. We didn't know what's going on. There are all these things appearing around the town that may have been connected. I was like, that's terrible. I'm going to play my plot twist card because we searched and we all made what skill checks we could. And there was like vaguely a clue that barely gave us anything at all, but it was like something to start with. I was like, I want to leave a plot twist card that said that it says the villain left a clue that gives us their identity and location and exact location. And the GM was like, and then like he frowned, and then he was just like, I'll just remind you that you found this thing that gave you this very vague clue. And I was like, okay, so knowing their identity and location would just take us to the end of the part. I'm assuming something like that. Like, I'm cool with that, but I'm cool with not getting any more. But like, it feels weird that I spent the card on this and didn't get any result. Like, and so I got the card back. But this was also the only time out of any of the sessions that I used a plot twist card.
Yeah.
So I would say you need to have the right situation. I think it doesn't work well for published adventures.
Yeah, and I also think that, you know, the specificity of the plot twist card where it needs to be, like, one specific thing as opposed to having a discussion of, like, you know, I'd like to spend a hero point to influence the scene, and then the GM and the player have a conversation on what might be something that's within the scope. I think that could work a lot more easily. Because then you can do something that's not like, I win this investigation, but is more like, yeah, you know, what about something that might be true about the room that's interesting and advantageous to us?
So, yeah, it definitely depends on how you are applying these sort of plot twists and adding elements to a scene. And just how your players do it. Like, there's some players who might spend their points to add something silly to the scene. I'm sort of a facilitator style. I try to work for problem solving, like to do the solution and follow the plot that the GM is trying to put in front of us, which means if I'm given this, I'm going to try to use it to solve whatever our issue is with it. But I will add something to the scene that solves it. This can actually, like, the facilitator play style as described in some Game Master guides sounds like it's only a good thing to have because they try to help the other players. They try to help the GM when people are derailing or going sideways, but it can actually be a problem if they are facilitating too well towards going forward, and it actually is sometimes better to have just the weird, silly players who spend, a facilitator would say, waste a point to just add some, like, frivolous thing into the scene, because that's usually just kind of good fun for everyone when they do that, whereas when you add something that to the scene that helps solve it, it may be too much.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, like, the things in Fabula Ultima where it's like, you know, somebody drops an item, or, like, you know, there's some situation, excuse me, that is...
You're excused.
That is favorable, or, you know, somebody has, like, gained some kind of a weakness, or something is exposed, or something like that. Things that are...
Fabula Ultima has a short list of usually acceptable things that also the GM has approval on, which is kind of really nice, because you don't have to just make something up, and a lot of them are pretty mild, so they're very likely not to cause there to be an issue. But when you have something that's more open-ended, then that can start being something where you need to talk to the group about the social contract and figure out where you're going to go.
So if you are looking for introducing something like that to your game, and you're concerned that, you know, you might have a player who's like, well, wait a minute, where are the boundaries on this? Then you might consider coming up with, like, a list like that of, like, here's at least a starting point of things to think about using this for.
That's right. Giving a starting point also helps you determine the scope, because players are usually good at comparing. So if you're like, here's 6 things you can use it for, you can also use it for other things of similar scope and narrative impact, they're going to realize they can't use it for something that's, like, much more than that.
And they're also not going to use it for something that's really small and then later
they
on
actually,
they
still might.
Well, they might, but they're not going to use it for something small and then be like, oh man, I should have later on.
They'll always know that they chose something that was much smaller than what they could have gotten, but that they just felt like it was cool. If they're like, no, I want the tiger to be blue. Like any reason, changing its elemental affinity for your... No! I just want it to be blue. I'm spending a point. Do you expect to get anything from this? No, but it's cool if the tiger is blue.
Okay.
It's like, okay, the tiger is blue. So, like, sometimes players will do that, and that's totally fair. So, players can definitely become part of the improv. As I mentioned near the beginning, they can help you recover from issues in improv. Collaboratively working together can be part of your group's social contract, and it really actually helps to have a group that is willing to work with you and not sort of like poke at you when you're trying to improv. So that was a great separate sort of side point in chat that led to some extra information and analysis. Do you have any more tips for them, Linda?
Nothing that's coming to mind right now.
All right. In that case, let's say goodbye to YouTube. Bye,
Bye,
YouTube.
YouTube.